On the 25th of July 1985, a press release changed America. It said 4 words: Rock Hudson has AIDS. Within hours, every television network in the United States was running the story. Every newspaper, every radio broadcast. The name Rock Hudson, the man who had been voted the most popular actor in America 8 times, who had made 45 films, who had kissed Doris Day and Elizabeth Taylor and Julie Andrews on screen with the wholesome charm of a man the entire country had decided was safe. That name was now attached to 4 words that the world had spent 4 years pretending did not apply to people like him. Rock Hudson has AIDS. And the world did not know what to do with that. Because here is what the world had decided about AIDS in 1985. AIDS happened to other people, to people on the margins, to people that Ronald Reagan's White House in 4 years of mounting deaths had not found it politically useful to acknowledge. By July 1985, over 12,000 Americans had been diagnosed. Over 6,000 had died. The President of the United States had not said the word AIDS publicly. Not once. Not in 4 years. And then Rock Hudson, America's golden man, the wholesome hero of 100 romantic comedies, the man whose face had sold more movie tickets than almost anyone alive, disclosed that he was dying of it. And everything changed. Not because Rock Hudson was more important than the 6,000 who had died before him, but because the world had decided who AIDS belonged to. And Rock Hudson did not fit. Here is the detail that almost nobody tells you about what happened next. One person had seen this coming. One person had been sitting with Rock Hudson through the diagnosis, through the secrecy, through the desperate trips to Paris for experimental treatment. One person had known and had been preparing, quietly, for what a public disclosure would mean, and what it would cost, and what it might finally change. That person was Elizabeth Taylor. And what she did with the next 10 years of her life, starting from the moment Rock Hudson's press release went out, is the most important thing Elizabeth Taylor ever did. More important than any film. More important than any marriage. More important than any diamond or any headline or any scandal that the world spent 50 years consuming. Stay with me. Because this is not a story about a man who died. This is a story about what one friendship, one specific, documented, extraordinary friendship between 2 people who had known each other since 1956 did to the history of American medicine. Elizabeth Taylor made a phone call after Rock Hudson's diagnosis that the White House did not want to receive. The response she got, or rather the response she did not get, is something that should be part of every conversation about this period that is coming. To understand what Rock Hudson and Elizabeth Taylor were to each other, you need to understand what they were before the friendship, before Giant, before the diagnosis, before 1985 changed everything. Rock Hudson was born Roy Harold Scherer Jr. on the 17th of November, 1925, in Winnetka, Illinois. His father was an auto mechanic who abandoned the family during the Great Depression. His mother remarried a former Marine named Wallace Fitzgerald, a man her son despised, and Roy was legally adopted, taking the name Roy Harold Fitzgerald. He grew up in a household that was not warm. He grew up understanding, from early age, that the world required performance rather than truth. He graduated high school in 1943 and joined the United States Navy during World War II. He was stationed in the Philippines as an aircraft mechanic. He returned to Los Angeles in 1946 and pursued acting with a determination that had nothing to do with natural talent and everything to do with will. Universal International signed him. His agent, a man named Henry Wilson, whose methods were as predatory as they were effective, renamed him. The Rock came from the Rock of Gibraltar. The Hudson came from the Hudson River. Roy Scherer Jr. from Winnetka became Rock Hudson from Hollywood. And here is the thing about Rock Hudson that the mythology of his career almost completely obscures. He was not naturally gifted. His first film required 38 takes for him to deliver a single line successfully. He could not remember dialogue. He used cue cards throughout his career, a fact that his colleagues worked carefully around because the man on screen was so physically commanding, so effortlessly present, so completely inhabiting the specific kind of masculine charm that 1950s Hollywood required that nobody watching ever noticed. He worked, he trained, he studied. He took the coaching universal, provided acting, singing, dancing, fencing, horseback riding, and he built a career from discipline rather than talent. And it worked completely. By 1957, by the time Giant had been released, and he had received his Academy Award nomination for Best Actor, Rock Hudson was voted the most popular actor in American cinemas. He stayed in the top 10 until 1964. 8 times a record, he was voted one of the best-dressed male stars in Hollywood. He was also, throughout all of this, gay. And here is what that meant in Hollywood in the 1950s. It meant that his agent, Henry Wilson, when Confidential magazine threatened to publish an exposé about Hudson's homosexuality in 1955, traded the private lives of 2 of his other clients to make the story go away. Rory Calhoun's prison record. Tab Hunter's arrest at a private party. Wilson sacrificed them to protect Hudson, and Hudson knew it. Shortly after the confidential threat, Hudson married Wilson's own secretary, Phyllis Gates. The marriage lasted 3 years. Gates filed for divorce in 1958, citing mental cruelty. The studio machinery had constructed a marriage to protect a product. The product survived. The people inside the machinery paid the costs. This is the world Rock Hudson inhabited. The world of institutional performance, of private truth and public fiction, of the specific, suffocating exhaustion of being one person in public and another person entirely in private. Elizabeth Taylor understood this world. She had been living inside it since she was 9 years old. They met in 1956, on the set of Giant. She was 24, he was 30, and what happened between them, not romantically, not in any of the ways that the studio system would have preferred to package. It was something rarer than romance. Recognition. 2 people who had both been manufactured by institutions, who had both been performing versions of themselves for public consumption since before they were adults, who had both developed through years of living in the specific loneliness of extraordinary fame, a precise and painful understanding of what it meant to be consumed rather than known. They recognized each other, and they became friends. The specific, durable, costly kind of friendship that neither of them found easily, because the world around both of them was filled with people who needed things from them, and genuine friendship requires someone who needs nothing at all. Rock Hudson kept his AIDS diagnosis secret for over a year after he received it. The reason he finally disclosed the specific chain of events that made disclosure inevitable involves a moment on a television press conference that his co-star Doris Day described as the most shocking thing she ever witnessed. That is coming. Rock Hudson was diagnosed with AIDS on the 5th of June, 1984. He was 58 years old. He had known for some time before the formal diagnosis that something was wrong. The weight loss, the fatigue, the specific progressive deterioration that AIDS produces in a body that is fighting a disease it cannot name yet. He told almost nobody. He continued working. He appeared in Dynasty, the primetime soap opera from December 1984 through April 1985, playing a wealthy horse breeder named Daniel Reese. His colleagues on set noticed that his lines were more difficult for him than usual. They noticed the weight loss. They said nothing publicly. The production worked around him with the specific, practiced discretion of a Hollywood machine that had been managing inconvenient truths about its stars for decades. He traveled to France, to other countries, seeking experimental treatment, seeking anything that might slow what the doctors in America were telling him was inevitable. He was the most popular actor of his generation, and he was dying, and the country he had entertained for 30 years had no treatment available, and its president had not acknowledged the epidemic that was killing him. Now, the 16th of July, 1985. Hollywood press conference. Doris Day was launching a new cable television show called Doris Day's Best Friends. Rock Hudson was the inaugural guest. They had made 3 films together: Pillow Talk, Lover Come Back, Send Me No Flowers, and their on-screen chemistry had been one of the defining features of early 1960s American cinema. Hudson arrived at the press conference. Doris Day later said that she had known he was very sick, but she came out and put her arms around him and said she was glad to see him, because that is what you do for someone you love who is dying. You show up, you hold them, you say you are glad to see them. The cameras captured what Hudson looked like that day. He was emaciated. The man who had been voted the most popular actor in America, whose physical presence had defined a decade of Hollywood masculinity, had lost so much weight that the clips of that press conference were broadcast on national news shows for days. The country was shocked. The speculation began immediately. Hudson traveled to Paris 2 days later for another round of treatment. On July 21, 5 days after the press conference, he collapsed in his room at the Ritz Hotel. His publicist initially claimed he had inoperable liver cancer. 4 days later, on the 25th of July, 1985, his French publicist confirmed the truth. Rock Hudson has AIDS. And here is what happened in the 48 hours that followed. The phone calls started. From colleagues, from journalists, from the public, from people who had watched Rock Hudson on screen for 30 years and were now processing, in real time, the specific collision of the man they had consumed as entertainment and the disease they had been told belonged to someone else. And from Elizabeth Taylor. She had known about the diagnosis. She was one of the small circle of people Hudson trusted with the truth. And when the disclosure became public, when the press release went out, and the news broadcasts ran the clips, and America began its 48-hour reckoning with what Rock Hudson's AIDS meant for everything it had believed. About the disease, Elizabeth Taylor made a decision. She was not going to let this be only his story. She was going to make it everybody's story. Elizabeth Taylor called the Reagan White House directly. She asked for help for Rock Hudson. What happened next, what she was told and what she was not told, and what she found on her desk 9 weeks before Hudson died, is the most specific act of political cowardice documented in this entire story. That is coming. Ronald Reagan knew Rock Hudson. This is not a minor detail. Ronald and Nancy Reagan and Rock Hudson had been friends for decades, from the days when Reagan was still an actor and Hudson was becoming a star, and they moved in the same social circles of conservative Hollywood. They had attended the same parties. They had sat at the same tables. Nancy Reagan later described Hudson as a friend. In July 1985, when Hudson was in the American Hospital of Paris, dying, Elizabeth Taylor contacted the Reagan White House. She asked for help. She asked that the administration use its access to experimental treatments being developed in France to assist Hudson specifically, and she asked for a broader acknowledgement of the AIDS crisis that had, by that point, killed thousands of Americans. The White House did not respond meaningfully. Ronald Reagan had not said the word AIDS publicly in 4 years of his presidency. By the time Hudson disclosed his diagnosis, over 12,000 Americans had been diagnosed and over 6,000 had died. Reagan's silence, his specific, documented, deliberate silence on a public health crisis of this scale, is one of the most extensively documented political failures of the 1980s. Hudson flew back to Los Angeles on July 30. Airlines refused to transport a patient with AIDS. He had to charter a private plane. He was so weak he was moved by stretcher. He and his medical attendants were the only passengers on the chartered Air France Boeing 747. He was flown by helicopter to UCLA Medical Center. He spent nearly a month there. He was released in late August. He went home to his house in Beverly Hills for private hospice care. Elizabeth Taylor was there, not in the performing way of someone managing a public image around a dying friend. Actually, there, visiting, sitting with him, being present in the specific way that she had been present for Rock Hudson for nearly 30 years as the person who required nothing from him except his company. She had also, by this point, begun the work that would define the final chapter of her professional life. She had helped found AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research. The organization was formed through the merger of a Los Angeles group led by Michael Gottlieb, Hudson's own physician, and a New York-based organization. Elizabeth Taylor was a founding force. She used her name, the name that 7 marriages and 50 years of scandal had made the most recognizable female name in American entertainment, and she put it on letterhead and at fundraising events, and in rooms that would finally, not otherwise have been accessible to people dying of AIDS in Etienne. She raised money, in amounts that nobody had managed before. Because nobody before her had combined the specific, enormous cultural capital of Elizabeth Taylor's name with the specific, urgent, undeniable reality of what was happening to people she loved. And here is the detail that should be part of every conversation about this period. In the same weeks that Elizabeth Taylor was raising money and founding organizations and sitting beside a dying friend, the White House that had declined to respond to her direct appeal sent Rock Hudson a get well message. 9 weeks before he died, a get well message. After 4 years of silence, after over 6,000 deaths, after refusing to say the word publicly, after the airlines refused to transport him, after he had to charter a plane to come home to die. A get well message. Rock Hudson died on the 2nd of October 1985. He was 59 years old. He had requested no funeral. His body was cremated hours after his death. His ashes were scattered in the channel between Los Angeles and Santa Catalina Island. After Rock Hudson died, Congress set aside $221 million for AIDS research within days. That number tells you something specific about what his disclosure had done, and it raises one question that Elizabeth Taylor spent the rest of her life asking. That question is coming. Here is what Rock Hudson's disclosure did. In the weeks immediately following the 25th of July, 1985, more than $1.8 million in private contributions to AIDS research was raised, more than double the amount collected in all of 1984. A few days after Hudson died, Congress set aside $221 million to develop a cure for AIDS. The Hollywood AIDS Benefit Commitment to Life had to move to a larger venue to accommodate the increased attendance following his announcement. And Ronald Reagan, who had not said the word AIDS publicly in 4 years, finally acknowledged the epidemic 2 months after Hudson's disclosure. One man's name, one press release, one moment of forced transparency from a man who had kept his private truth hidden for a year because the world he lived in required that performance of him produced, in the months that followed, the single largest shift in public and political attention to the AIDS crisis that had yet occurred. Morgan Fairchild said it most simply. She said, "Rock Hudson's death gave AIDS a face." Elizabeth Taylor understood what that meant before anyone else did, and she understood something else. Something that the $221 million congressional appropriation and the increased donations and the move to larger venue benefit did not say directly. The face had always been there. The 6,000 people who died before Rock Hudson had faces. They had names. They had people who loved them and sat beside them and held their hands in hospital rooms while the country's president refused to say the word. What Rock Hudson's disclosure changed was not the reality of AIDS. It was the world's willingness to look at it. And Elizabeth Taylor, who had spent 50 years being consumed by a world that looked at her without seeing her, understood, with the specific clarity of someone who knew exactly what the difference between being watched and being seen felt like understood, that the willingness to look was the beginning, not the end. The beginning. She spent the next 25 years making sure the looking did not stop. She testified before Congress. She appeared at fundraisers. She wrote letters. She made phone calls. She sat on the board of AMFAR and used her name and her access and her specific, enormous cultural presence in every space where it could move money and attention toward the people who needed both. She raised, over the course of her lifetime, more than $270 million for HIV/AIDS research. $270 million. From a woman the world spent 50 years counting marriages. Now here is the detail about that number that requires saying. In 1985, when Elizabeth Taylor was sitting beside Rock Hudson in his house in Beverly Hills and making phone calls that the White House did not meaningfully return, the scientific understanding of HIV/AIDS was at a prosy stage where early intervention could change outcomes, where research funding could accelerate the development of treatments that would transform the disease from a death sentence to a manageable condition, where the specific, timed injection of resources into the right research programs could save lives that would otherwise be lost. The $270 million that Elizabeth Taylor raised did not arrive after the crisis had passed. It arrived during it, when it was most needed. When the government that should have been providing it was sending get-well messages 9 weeks before people died, Elizabeth Taylor stood in the gap. Not because it was safe, not because it was good for her career, not because Hollywood rewarded the women who held dying men's hands in 1985 with professional opportunities. She stood in the gap because Rock Hudson was her friend, because she had known him since 1956, because she had recognized, in him, the specific exhaustion of performing a version of yourself for public consumption that has nothing to do with who you actually are. Because when the press release went out and America began its 48-hour reckoning, she was already there. She had been there for years. She was not going anywhere. Rock Hudson made one direct contribution to AmFAR before he died. The amount, the timing. What he said in the telegram he was too ill to deliver in person is the most specific thing he did in his final weeks. That is coming, and it will change how you think about what courage actually looks like. Shortly before he died, Rock Hudson made a contribution, $250,000, his own money, directly to AmFAR. The first direct contribution to the organization that Elizabeth Taylor had helped found. The contribution that helped launch it as a functioning entity rather than a concept. He also sent a telegram to the Hollywood AIDS benefit commitment to life, the benefit he was too ill to attend in person. In it, he said, "I am not happy that I am sick. I am not happy that I have AIDS. But if that is helping others, I can at least know that my own misfortune has had some positive worth." Read that again. A man who was dying, who had spent 30 years in a career built on concealing who he actually was, who had watched his illness become a public event without his full consent, who had been refused transport by airlines and received a get-well message from a president who had been his friend. He found, in the middle of all of that, the specific, clear-eyed generosity of someone who understood that his suffering, if directed correctly, could mean something beyond itself. I can at least know that my own misfortune has had some positive worth. Elizabeth Taylor read that telegram. She had been the one helping make it possible for his misfortune to have worth. She had been the one ensuring that the attention his disclosure had generated did not dissipate back into the comfortable silence that the White House preferred. And here is what the silence had cost, what the 4 years of presidential non-acknowledgement had actually produced in human terms. By the time Reagan finally said the word AIDS publicly in September 1985, 2 months after Hudson's disclosure, 8 months before Reagan's first public speech specifically about AIDS in 1987, over 20,000 Americans had been diagnosed. Over 12,000 had died. The people who died between the emergence of the first cluster of symptomatic patients in 1981 and Rock Hudson's disclosure in 1985, the people whose faces were not Rock Hudson's face, whose names did not carry the weight of 8-time most popular actor, whose deaths did not prompt congressional appropriations. Those people are the measure of what the silence cost. Elizabeth Taylor knew their names too. Not all of them, but enough. Because she had been in the rooms. She had been at the benefits that could not fill their original venues. She had been making the phone calls that the White House did not return. And she had understood, from the beginning of her involvement with this cause, something that the political establishment was not prepared to say clearly. This was not a disease that belonged to other people. It never had been. The 6,000 who died before Rock Hudson, the people whose faces were not famous enough to move congressional appropriations, they had deserved the same urgency, the same funding, the same president who said their name. They did not receive it. Elizabeth Taylor spent 25 years ensuring that the people who came after them received something better. In the final section, I want to ask you one question about Elizabeth Taylor that has never been asked in any documentary about her life. A question about what $270 million actually means and why the world has almost no idea she raised it. That is coming. Here is the question. Elizabeth Taylor raised $270 million for HIV/AIDS research. She did this over 25 years, starting in 1985 when the government would not, when Hollywood was quiet, when the venues for the benefits were being moved to smaller rather than larger spaces, when the airlines were refusing to transport dying patients. She raised $270 million. And if you asked the average person on the street what Elizabeth Taylor is most famous for, what the defining fact of her life is, what comes to mind when her name is mentioned, they would say the marriages. 7 marriages. That is the number the world kept. That is the number that became the shorthand for who she was. Not the 270 million, not the Amfar Foundation, not the congressional testimony, not the 25 years of sitting in rooms that the president would not acknowledge, not the specific, costly, human act of holding a dying man's hand when the country he had entertained for 30 years was not willing to do it. The marriages, 7 of them, that is what they kept. And here is the specific, uncomfortable question that this raises. If Elizabeth Taylor had been a man, if the same career, the same activism, the same $270 million had been raised by a male actor of equivalent fame, would the marriages have been the story? Or would the 270 million have been the story? You already know the answer. Rock Hudson's death gave AIDS a face. Morgan Fairchild said it, and she was right. But here is the thing about that face. The face changed what the world was willing to look at. The face moved congressional appropriations. The face moved private donations. The face did not do the 25 years of work that followed. Elizabeth Taylor did that. Without a face that the world needed, without the specific, tragic timing of a public disclosure that forced a reckoning. Without dying, she did it alive, present, working, for 25 years. And the world counted her marriages. Rock Hudson died on the 2nd of October, 1985. He was 59 years old. He had requested no funeral. His body was cremated hours after his death. His ashes were scattered in the ocean. There is a cenotaph at Forest Lawn Cemetery in Cathedral City, California. A monument without remains. A name in stone for a man who asked for nothing when he was gone. He was, by every account from the people who loved him, Julie Andrews, Doris Day, Susan St. James, Elizabeth Taylor, genuinely kind, generous with his time, warm in the specific way of people who had not been warm to themselves for a very long time and overcompensated in the direction of other people. He had spent 30 years performing a version of himself that bore no resemblance to who he actually was. And he had done it not because he was dishonest in his character, but because the institution he worked for had made honesty professionally fatal. Because the country he entertained had made his truth into a scandal before he had a chance to make it into a story. And then, in the specific, terrible mercy of a diagnosis that forced transparency, his truth became the most important story in American public health. His misfortune had positive worth. He said so himself. Elizabeth Taylor outlived Rock Hudson by 26 years. She died on the 23rd of March 2011. She was 79 years old. Congestive heart failure. She died in Cedars-Sinai Medical Center in Los Angeles, the same city where she had held Rock Hudson's hand while the government sent get-well messages. She had raised $270 million. She had helped found an organization that contributed materially to the research that transformed AIDS from a death sentence into a manageable chronic condition. The antiretroviral treatments that now allow people with HIV to live full lives. The research infrastructure that made those treatments possible was built, in part, with money that Elizabeth Taylor raised when it was not safe or fashionable or professionally useful to raise it. She was not celebrated for this primarily. She was celebrated for the marriages, for the diamonds, for the specific, consuming mythology of a woman who had too much of everything and could not stop reaching for more. Here is what I take from the friendship between Elizabeth Taylor and Rock Hudson. Two people who had both been built into products by institutions that needed them to be something other than what they were found in each other. The specific, rare relief of being seen without requirement, without performance, without the institutional need for a particular version of who they were. And when one of them was dying, when the institution that had required his performance for 30 years was not there, when the government that had benefited from his taxes and his cultural output was sending get-well messages, the other one showed up. She did not show up for the cameras. She showed up because he was her friend. And then she spent 25 years making sure that his death meant something beyond itself, that the face his death gave to AIDS was followed by the funding and the research and the political acknowledgement that the faces before his had deserved and not received. $270 million. Raised by a woman, the world spent 50 years counting marriages. Before you go, I want to ask you something I have been thinking about since I started researching this video. Rock Hudson's disclosure changed American history. The congressional appropriations, the private donations, the president who finally said the word. But the 6,000 people who died before him, whose faces were not famous enough to move governments, they deserve the same urgency. Does it feel like justice that it took a famous face to make the world look? Leave your answer below. I read every single comment. If this story moved you, please share it. Because Elizabeth Taylor raised $270 million and the world counted her marriages. And Rock Hudson asked for no funeral, and his ashes were scattered in the ocean, and the country he entertained for 30 years sent him a get-well message 9 weeks before he died. They both deserved better than the story they were given. Next video, we go deeper into the world of women, the system built and then blamed for breaking. A woman whose connection to everything you have heard today runs deeper than most people realize, and whose story of being consumed by an institution and surviving it will make this video feel suddenly and uncomfortably familiar. Subscribe so you do not miss it. Thank you for being here.